skipping ahead a little bit here. They arrive at the island. Go straight in. Musashi flew off the quilted coat. The bow advanced at a very restrained pace. Suzuki could not bring himself to stroke with vigor. His arms moved only slightly, exerting little force. The sound of bulbous was in the air. Sasuke, yes, sir. It's shallow enough here. There's no need to get close. You don't want to damage your boat. Besides, it's about time for the tide to turn. Silently, Suzuki fixed his eyes on a tall, thin pine tree standing alone. Underneath it, the wind was playing with a brilliant red cloak. Sasuke started to point, but realized that Musashi had already seen his opponent. Keeping his eyes on Ganryu, Musashi took a russet hand towel from his obi, folded it in 4 lengthwise, and tied it around his wind-blown hair. Then he shifted his short sword to the front of his obi. Taking off his long sword, he laid it in the bottom of the boat and covered it with a reed mat. In his right hand, he held the wooden sword he had made from the broken oar. This is far enough, he said to Suzuki. So, he's going to fight the best swordsman in the world. He carves a wooden sword out of an oar on the way, leaves his long sword in the boat.
And there is, this is a novel, but there's also some historic precedent for this. So he would routinely use wooden swords when dueling with opponents who were using live blades.
Okay. Back to the book. At that moment, Musashi, his hakama, which is pants. They're like...
Yeah, it's kind of like a Japanese kilt, let's say. Very, very long. Usually comes down to the ankles.
His hakama, hitched high on both sides, jumped lightly into the sea, landing so lightly he barely made a splash. He strode rapidly toward the waterline, his wooden sword cutting through the spray. 5 steps. 10 steps. Sasuke, abandoning his skull, watched in wonderment, unconscious of where he was, what he was doing. As Ganryu streaked away from the pine like a red streamer, his polished scabbard caught the glint of the sun. Musashi! Ganryu planted his feet resolutely in the sand, unwilling to give up an inch. Musashi stopped and stood still, exposed to the water and the wind. A hint of a grin appeared on his face. Kojiro, he said quietly. There was an unearthly fierceness in his eyes, a force pulling so irresistibly it threatened to draw Kojiro inexorably into the peril and destruction. The waves washed his wooden sword. Ganryu's were the eyes that shot fire. A bloodthirsty flame burned in his pupils like the rainbows of fierce intensity, seeking to terrify and debilitate. Musashi! No answer. Musashi! The sea rumbled ominously in the distance. The tide lapped and murmured at the 2 men's feet. You're late again, aren't you? Is that your strategy? As far as I'm concerned, it's a cowardly ploy. It's 2 hours past the appointed time. I was here at 8, just as promised. I've been waiting. Musashi did not reply. You did this at Ichijoji, and before that at the Rengyon. Your method seems to be to throw your opponent off by deliberately making him wait. That trick will get you nowhere with Ganryu. Now prepare your spirit and come forward bravely so future generations won't laugh at you. Come ahead and fight, Musashi. The end of his scabbard rose high behind him as he drew the great drying pole. With his left hand, he slid off the scabbard and threw it into the water. Waiting just long enough for a wave to strike the reef and retreat, Musashi suddenly said in a quiet voice, You've lost, Kojiro. What? Ganryu was shaken to the core. The fight's been fought. I say you've been defeated. What are you talking about? If you were going to win, you wouldn't throw your scabbard away. You've cast away your future, your life. Words! Nonsense! Too bad, Kojiro. Ready to fall? Do you want to get it over with fast? Come forward, you bastard! Ho! Musashi's cry and the sound of the water rose to a crescendo together. Stepping into the water, the drying pole positioned high above his head, Ganru faced Musashi squarely. A line of white foam streaked across the surface as Musashi ran up on shore to Ganru's left. Ganru pursued. Musashi's feet left the water and touched the sand at almost the same instant that Ganru's sword, his whole body, hurtled at him like a flying fish. When Musashi sensed that the drying pole was coming toward him, his body was still at the end of the motion that had taken him out of the water, leaning slightly forward. He held the wooden sword with both hands, extended out to the right behind him and partially hidden. Satisfied with his position, he half grunted, an almost noiseless sound that wafted before Ganru's face. The drying pole had appeared to be on the verge of a downward slice, but it wavered slightly, then stopped. 9 feet away from Musashi, Ganru changed directions by leaping nimbly to the right. The two men stared at each other. Musashi, 2 or 3 paces from the water, had the sea to his back. Ganru was facing him, his sword held high with both hands. Their lives were totally absorbed in deadly combat, and both were free from conscious thought. The scene of battle was a perfect vacuum. But in the waiting stations and beyond the sound of the waves, countless people held their breaths. Above Ganru hovered the prayers and the hopes of those who believed in him and wanted him to live. Above Musashi, the prayers and hopes of others. Of Seido and Iori on the island. Of Otsu and Osugi and Gonosuke on the beach. Of Akemi and Matahachi on their hill. All their prayers were directed to heaven. Here, hopes, prayers, and the gods were of no assistance, nor was chance. There was only a vacuum, impersonal and perfectly impartial. Is this vacuum so difficult of achievement by one who has life, the perfect expression of the mind that has risen above thought and transcended ideas? The two men spoke without speaking. Then to each came the unconscious realization of the other. The pores of their bodies stood out like needles directed at the adversary. Muscles, flesh, nail, hair, even eyebrows, all bodily elements that partake of life were united into a single force against the enemy, defending the living organism of which they were part. The mind alone was one with the universe, clear and untroubled, like the reflection of the moon in a pond amidst the ragings of a typhoon. To reach this sublime immobility is the supreme achievement. It seemed like eons, but the interval was in fact short, the time required for the waves to come in and recede a half a dozen times. Then a great shout, more than vocal, coming from the depths of being, shattered the instant. It came from Ganru, and was followed immediately by Musashi's shout. The two cries, like angry waves lashing a rocky shore, sent their spirits skyward. The challenger's sword, raised so high that it seemed to threaten the sun, streaked through the air like a rainbow. Musashi threw his left shoulder forward, drew his right foot back, and shifted his upper body into a position half facing his opponent. His wooden sword, held in both hands, swept through the air at the same moment that the tip of the drying pole came down directly before his nose. The breathing of the two combatants grew louder than the sound of the waves. Now the wooden sword was extended at eye level, the drying pole high above its bearer's head. Ganru had bounded about 10 paces away, where he had the sea to one side. Though he had not succeeded in injuring Musashi in his first attack, he had put himself in a much better position. Had he remained where he was, with the sun reflecting from the water into his eyes, his vision would soon have faltered, then his spirit, and he would have been at Musashi's mercy. With renewed confidence, Ganru began inching forward, keeping a sharp eye out for a chink in Musashi's defense and steeling his own spirit for a decisive move. Musashi did the unexpected. Instead of proceeding slowly and cautiously, he strode boldly toward Ganru, his sword projecting before him, ready to thrust into Ganru's eyes. The artlessness of this approach brought Ganru to a halt. He almost lost sight of Musashi. The wooden sword rose straight in the air. With one great kick, Musashi leapt high and, folding his legs, reduced his 6-foot frame to 4 feet or less. Yeah! Ganru's sword screamed through the space above him. The stroke missed, but the tip of the drying pole cut through Musashi's headband, which went flying through the air. Ganru mistook it for his opponent's head, and a smile flitted briefly across his face. The next instant, his skull broke like gravel under the blow of Musashi's sword. As Ganru lay where the sand met the grass, his face betrayed no consciousness of defeat. Blood streamed from his mouth, but his lips formed a smile of triumph. Oh no! Ganru! Forgetting himself, Iwama Kabuki jumped up, and with him, all his retinue, their faces distorted with shock. Then they saw Nagoda, Sadu, and Iori sitting calmly and sedately on their benches. Shamed, they somehow managed to keep from running forward. They tried to regain a degree of composure, but there was no concealing their grief and delusion. Some swallowed hard, refusing to believe what they had seen, and their minds went blank. In an instant, the island was quiet and still as it had ever been. Only the rustle of the pines and the swaying grasses mocked the frailty and the impermanence of mankind. Musashi was watching a small cloud in the sky. As he did, his soul returned to his body, and it became possible for him to distinguish between the cloud and himself, between his body and the universe. Sasaki Kojiro Ganru did not return to the world of the living. Lying face down, he still had a grip on his sword. His tenacity was still visible. There was no sign of anguish on his face. Nothing but satisfaction at having fought a good fight, not the faintest shadow of regret. The sight of his own headband lying on the ground sent shivers up and down Musashi's spine. Never in this life, he thought, would he meet another opponent like this. A wave of admiration and respect flowed over him. He was grateful to Kojiro for what the man had given him. In strength, in the will to fight, he ranked higher than Musashi. And it was because of this that Musashi had been forced to excel himself. What was it that had enabled Musashi to defeat Kojiro? Skill? The help of the gods? While knowing it was neither of these, Musashi was never able to express a reason in words. Certainly it was something more important than either strength or godly providence. Kojiro had put his confidence in the sword of strength and skill. Musashi trusted in the sword of spirit. That was the only difference between them. Silently, Musashi walked the 10 paces to Kojiro and knelt beside him. He put his left hand near the nostrils of Kojiro and found there was no trace of breath. With the right treatment, he may recover, Musashi told himself. And he wanted to believe this. Wanted to believe that this most valiant of all adversaries would be spared. But the battle was over. It was time to go. Farewell, he said to Kojiro, then to the officials on their benches. Having bowed once to the ground, he ran to the reef and jumped into the boat. There was not a drop of blood on his wooden sword. The tiny craft moved out to sea. Who is to say where? There is no record as to whether Ganryu's supporters on Hikojima attempted to take revenge. People do not give up their loves and hates as long as life lasts. Waves of feeling come and go with the passage of time. Throughout Musashi's lifetime, there were those who resented his victory and criticized his conduct on that day. He rushed away, it was said, because he feared reprisal. He was confused. He even neglected to administer the coup de grace. The world is always full of the sound of waves. The little fishes, abandoning themselves to the waves, dance and sing and play. But who knows the heart of the sea 100 feet down? Who knows its depth? The end.